Hello guys, welcome back to our anime explainer. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 Peerless Tang Men based on novel. So let's start. While the huge lizard had charged with ferocious momentum, it was now unable to move even an inch closer, blocked by the Xuanwu shield. Shu Sanxia pulled Jiang Nannan with his left hand while he unleashed his shield with his right hand. Jiang Nannan exploited the momentum of his pull to flip her body up, before she did a handstand on his head. After this, she bent her waist as if she had no bones in her body. Her toes touched the top of the soul beast's neck. Her second soul ring lit up, and a strange yellow glow spread from her legs. After this, Jiang Nannan started to spin rapidly, using her body as a pivot. Jiang Nannan's second soul skill was called gravity control. She wasn't just controlling her opponent, she was also controlling herself. The huge lizard's head was slammed against the wall. Jiang Nannan exerted force with her toes, and directly crushed the central nerves of this thousand-year lizard. Its body started contorting, and it was unable to crawl forward anymore. Nan Shueishui, Nan Xiuqiu, and Yigai followed the members of the Tang sect, ready to reinforce them if needed. Nan Xiuqiu and Yigai were still fine. They fully understood the abilities of everyone from the Tang sect, but this was the first time Nan Shueishui had witnessed them in action. She was very impressed with all these young people, who possessed 6-ringed, and even 7-ringed cultivations. Not only did they possess the best combination of soul rings, but each of them had specialized in something. When they unleashed their soul skills, they were extremely strong, and their control was even more frightening. They didn't waste a single drop of their soul power, and were always able to defeat their enemies with the simplest method. Ji Juechen was still the most lethal among everyone. When he slashed his judgment sword, thousand-year soul beasts were completely unable to resist his strength. Wherever his sword light passed, all the soul beasts that attempted to climb the city wall were killed. 10,000-year soul beasts were only able to resist him slightly before they were overwhelmed. While the movements of his sword were very simple, he was definitely not inferior to an 8-ringed soul Duoduo in terms of lethality. More and more soul beasts were charging up towards the top of the city walls. As physical combat started to break out, Shrek Academy fully demonstrated its strength. Every teacher and student possessed great fighting strength. Furthermore, they shared great chemistry with one another. The assault type, agility type, defense type, auxiliary type, and control type soul masters coordinated very well with one another. They suffered very few casualties, as they managed to fight off the assault of the soul beasts. The soul rings that the Tang sect had obtained under the leadership of Xian Zuan earlier played a very important role right now. Many of the Shrek City Defense Army's soul masters were strengthened because of those soul rings, and the overall abilities of the army had greatly increased as a result. All the stationary soul cannon shells had been fired, and the soul beast army had suffered great casualties. From the air, it was clear that the soul beast army was no longer dense. There were empty spaces in many parts of the army. Bai Ji had already given her best. However, she was helpless, since many of the stationary soul cannon shells weren't fired in her direction. Soul tools were still very effective, even though the battle had now begun to be fought through physical means. Over the past few years, Shrek Academy had started to value the use of soul tools by soul masters. In the martial soul department, there were even special classes designed to instruct soul masters on the use of soul tools. They weren't just taught how to use long-range soul tools, but also taught how to operate close combat soul tools. Along with the help of the self-driving forts, Shrek Academy was able to hold off the onslaught of the soul beasts, even though they were under great pressure. Different sparks could be seen in the sky and on the ground. The sky was the battlefield of the strong soul masters and soul beasts. From the elders of the sea gods pavilion to the inner and outer courtyard teachers, those that had 7 rings or more mainly fought in the sky. Their opponents were soul beasts with cultivations of 50,000 years or more. Soul masters fought based on their intelligence, abilities, and the help of soul tools. While there were more wounded soul masters, very few of them died. Once someone was injured, he was immediately replaced while he sought medical attention. After being treated, he would be sent out to fight once again. The amount of medicine that Shrek Academy had stored could rival that of an empire. It was the result of 10,000 years of accumulation. Time passed, second after second, as the battle became more and more brutal. The soul beast's aerial army became even more determined. Even after paying such a huge price, they still weren't willing to retreat. 2 hours passed. 4 hours passed. More and more casualties started to appear on Shrek City's walls. The carcasses of soul beasts started to pile up, and various colors of soul rings started to appear. Some of them were extremely valuable. Shrek was on the verge of collapse, but what about the soul beasts? From Bai Ji's pale face, it was evident that the soul beast army had suffered great losses as well. As this was an all-out attack, the soul beasts that were charging in front were either 1,000-year or 10,000-year soul beasts. However, these powerful soul beasts were greatly drained right now. The 100-year soul beasts that followed behind them were obviously lacking in terms of abilities. Bai Ji knew that the Great Star Do Forest would have to bear heavy losses even if they won this battle. Although there hadn't yet been any great losses to their higher-end combat strength, they would lose too many 100,000 and 10,000-year soul beasts. If they were struck by the stationary soul cannon shells, they were completely wiped out. The 2,000 stationary soul cannon shells had wiped out a third of the soul beast army. It would take centuries to replenish this number of soul beasts. However, there was no way out of this war right now. The eyes of all the soul beasts had turned bloodshot by now. It was too difficult to retreat. Only the blood of Shrek City could wash away this hatred of theirs. Up in the sky, Qian was still restrained by Elder Xian and Elder Mu. At times lights flashed in the sky, showing that Qian was struggling. 6 hours of the afternoon had passed. Night descended once again. Shrek City was shaking, and looked like it could collapse at any time. However, it managed to persist for another hour even as it shook. It seemed like there was some special force protecting it that prevented it from collapsing completely. This special force was called faith. It was a faith in Shrek, and a faith to protect Shrek's glory. It had only been 2 days since the beast wave appeared. However, Shrek City was brought to its knees in just those 2 days. 100 years ago, Shrek Academy's soul tool development hadn't reached its current state when the last beast wave appeared. However, Shrek Academy had the body sex help then, which had enabled them to survive until reinforcements arrived. Furthermore, Bai Ji wasn't present then, so that beast wave was naturally not as strong. 2 days. It had only been 2 days. Even if the reinforcements came at top speed, they couldn't arrive so quickly. Even though Shrek was already proud of how they had been performing, as they made the soul beasts, who were lying on the flat ground outside the city, and on top of the city wall pay a painful price, was Shrek City still going to walk the path of destruction? The lights of their soul tools had practically disappeared. Almost all the soul tools used to defend the city had been destroyed. The self-driving forts had also retreated into the city due to a lack of sealed milk bottles to power them. The soul engineers driving them drained their own soul power to bring these self-driving forts back into the city. At the eastern side of the city, Elder Song and Xian Lin'er fought the Bear Lord, but they were continuously being forced back. At the southern city wall, the fighting was already spread across the top of the city wall. The soul masters were exhausted. Against such a large number of soul beasts, their soul power was continuously drained even though they had the upper hand and kept on killing soul beasts. Everyone knew that the collapse of Shrek City could happen at any time. Once one side of the city fell, a chain reaction would begin. All of them grit their teeth and persisted. Even though they knew they were going to die, they didn't want the collapse of Shrek City to start from their side. Boom. A deafening boom echoed across all of Shrek City. Even those who were busy fighting couldn't help but turn their attention towards the origin of that deafening boom. It came from the eastern city wall. Elder Song's speed was slowing down as time passed, and as a result of her age. She didn't manage to dodge one attack, and was struck to the top of the eastern city wall by the Bear Lord's dark golden terraclaw. Suddenly, a huge, irregular hole that was around 20 meters wide appeared in the city wall. Doomed. The soldiers defending the eastern city wall turned extremely dismal. They were already in such a dire situation. If the city wall was damaged, they would lose the only thing they could depend on. Was the final breach going to occur here? The Bear Lord roared excitedly. The soul beasts outside the eastern side of Shrek City risked everything and charged towards this huge hole. Shrek City's soldiers were too fatigued. Even though they knew they had to give their all to plug this hole, they didn't have the energy to even move their legs. Their soul power had been completely drained. While they really wanted to cover this hole, they were completely helpless right now. Were they really doomed? At this critical moment, a beam of gentle golden light suddenly spread out from within Shrek City, coming from the direction of Shrek Academy. That beam of golden light spread very quickly. In an instant, It reached all the way to the city walls. All the humans felt warmth as they were immersed in this golden light. They felt an indescribable comfort, and their energy and soul power started to quickly recover. All the soul beasts were also pushed off from the city walls by a strong force. Surprised cheers sounded from all four sides of the city walls at the same time. Even the stronger soul masters from Shrek quickly retreated to the region covered by the beam of golden light. Even when the Bear Lord, Myriad Demon King, and Scarlet King attacked with all their might, they weren't able to shake this beam of golden light. Right now, the entirety of Shrek City seemed to have been engulfed by an invincible barrier. While the soldiers and soul masters were cheering, the elders from the Sea God's Pavilion weren't delighted. Only they knew where that force came from. It was the strength of the golden tree. This strength was the ultimate strength that the ancestors of Shrek had left behind to protect Shrek after they fused with the golden tree. It could only be tapped into in the direst of situations. Elder Mu had used the powers of the golden tree once before to support him and Elder Xian in restraining Qian. At this time, the golden tree's powers were used once more to protect the entire city, and to help Shrek City's warriors recover. The amount of energy that this endeavor consumed from the golden tree was astounding. The battle wasn't over, and the Soul Beast army remained just outside the city. They were still charging against the wall as if they felt no exhaustion, and the golden tree's energies were being continuously spent. This also meant that Elder Mu and Elder Xian were drawing less energy from the golden tree on their side, and this also meant they would seal Qian for a shorter period of time. It was a desperate method to solve their problems at hand without any consideration for the consequences, a solution that they could only turn to when they had no other choice. Elder Song hovered in mid-air and felt her soul power regenerating as she gazed into the sky and muttered, "If the golden tree is used like that one more time, we may no longer be able to maintain that seal in the sky." Unleashing the golden tree's energies directly affected the seal in the sky. The light ripples in the sky were now visibly stronger than before, as if Qian's struggles had become much more intense. This protection would only allow Shrek's warriors to last for another 2 to 4 more hours. But what about afterwards? Shrek Academy's senior individuals were contemplating this problem and were almost hopeless. Suddenly, the Valkyrie Duoduo, Xian Lin'er pointed to a certain direction and asked, "Mum, look, what's that?" She was pointing towards the northwest. She was high in the sky, so she could see clearly, and even though the night was dark, the dark green light that shone faintly from that direction were unnaturally obvious and glaring. Those dark green hues were tinged with dark red and white, and seemed very drifty and fleeting as they moved towards Shrek City. These dots were still quite sparse and dispersed in the beginning, but they swiftly grew in number within her field of vision. They became dense and compact as they tramped towards Shrek City, and even though they weren't moving very quickly, they were definitely moving towards Shrek City. What are those things? Are they our reinforcements? Elder Song focused her attention towards those lights. The night was dark, and those lights were still quite a distance away, so she couldn't see very clearly. Xian Lin'er forced a laugh and replied, "My only wish is that those things aren't reinforcements for the Soul Beast army." The army of Soul Beasts didn't seem to sense the arrival of those unwelcome guests, because the golden light that suddenly emerged from Shrek City caused quite a disturbance among them. The Bear Lord, the Myriad Demon King, the Scarlet King, and the other powerful Soul Beasts were attacking that golden light with every ounce of their strength. There were quite a few of them now, and it didn't take long before many different colors dotted the horizon densely in the distance. Xian Lin'er swiftly descended back into the city. She retrieved a telescopic soul tool and then gazed towards the northwest again, and her face quickly became ghastly pale. What are those things? Tell me. What can be worse than total annihilation of Shrek City? Elder Song laughed bitterly as she spoke. Xian Lin'er was momentarily stunned. I can see skeletons, jiangshi, headless horsemen, and many different strange and peculiar creatures. They seem like the Holy Ghost Church. Elder Song was also taken aback. If the Holy Ghost Church interfered at a time like this, they were definitely not here to aid Shrek City. Shrek City was currently besieged by a great army of soul beasts, and the Holy Ghost Church would have only one goal if they were here. They wanted to reap unfair gains from this battle. There were a spectacular number of soul beasts who had perished on the battlefield, and quite a number of Shrek City's soldiers were also dead. Those spirits and corpses had always been what the Holy Ghost Church liked best. That's not right. If they were here to reap unfair benefits, they wouldn't have appeared so quickly. They would have waited until both sides suffered heavy losses before making a move so that they could maximize their profits and gains. Furthermore, they would have to defeat this powerful beast tide. The Holy Ghost Church can't be that stupid. Can it be that they are unafraid of the beast tide attacking them? Xian Lin'er was full of doubts and confusion. Elder Song's expression was solemn as she said, "Unless the Holy Ghost Church has something to do with this beast tide from the Great Star Do Forest, perhaps this has been their arrangement from the start." Xian Lin'er snapped around at her mother and said, "Mum, your speculation is too frightening. However, the Great Star Do Forest's soul beasts should hate the Holy Ghost Church more than they hate us. How can those soul beasts work together with them?" Elder Song heaved a sigh and said, "It doesn't matter whether my guess is frightening or not. The only thing we can do is resign ourselves to fate." The golden tree's golden light dome was becoming increasingly weaker, and Shrek's soul masters had recovered to about 50% of their physical energy and their soul power. They had another shot in this battle, but could they really see the light at the end of the tunnel? Right at this moment, the soul beast army finally discovered the masses of unwelcome guests that were coming from the northwest. Shrek Academy's powerful individuals, who were hovering and watching in mid-air, heaved a sigh of relief when they saw the soul beast's reaction. A pack of soul beasts separated from the back of the great army outside the western and northern city walls and charged towards those unwelcome guests. Apparently, those unwelcome guests seemed ferocious and unfriendly to them as well. Elder Song suddenly raised her voice and hollered in the sky, "Our reinforcements are here. Hold on, everyone. Victory is in sight." Her voice was very loud, and sound waves resonated throughout every corner of Shrek City. She soared through the sky as she spoke, transformed into a green shadow godly hawk once more, and flew towards the Bear Lord. Elderly people had the most experience and the most wisdom. Temporarily disregarding the fact that Elder Song was the strongest individual in Shrek City's camp for now, her calm response during a crucial moment to utilize these unwelcome guests, so that she could galvanize Shrek's warriors, created very important effects. At this point, Shrek City's warriors were all fatigued and exhausted. The golden tree could only help them recover part of their physical strength and soul power, but it couldn't take away their fatigue and their exhausted minds. What else was better to boost morale other than reinforcements? Reinforcements meant hope, the hope to survive. The golden tree's protection quietly dissipated, and the battle erupted once more after that temporary pause. Shrek's soul masters had managed to recover part of their strength via the golden tree's powers, and they seemed like they had been injected with steroids as their morale flourished. The coordination and teamwork that they seemed to have lost due to their fatigue and exhaustion seemed to return, and the soldiers managed to suppress the soul beasts to the point where they couldn't charge onto the top of the city wall. This was the fighting strength that morale brought. Word of reinforcements had reignited the flames in everyone's hearts. The pack of soul beasts, who had separated from the army, clashed with the strange mass of unwelcome guests in the distance. Both parties started to fight, but they were quite a distance away, and nothing much could be clearly seen. However, everyone could see beams of light glowing here and there, and the soul beasts were clearly unleashing various soul skills to fight those unwelcome guests. The flickering lights that came from those unwelcome guests in the distance were quickly extinguished, but they seemed like the beast tide when they attacked the city. There were just so many of them. It didn't take long before the pack of soul beasts were overrun, and the mass of unwelcome guests began to pick up the pace as they charged towards Shrek City. Xian Lin'er helped her mother fight back soul beasts, while she monitored those unwelcome guests in the distance. Reinforcements. Are they really reinforcements? How can those spectral creatures be reinforcements for Shrek City? But they are clearly fighting the army of soul beasts. How else can these forces be explained other than that they are reinforcements? Furious howls could be heard continuously from within the soul beast army. Orders came down from the higher rank soul beasts, and the army didn't separate any more forces to fight those unwelcome guests. They continued to attack Shrek City arrogantly with everything they had. The enormous army of spectral creatures were coming closer and closer, and they quickly arrived near the edge of the soul beast army. Fortunately, the night was dark, and Shrek City's soldiers couldn't see anything at all as they fought on the city wall. They could only see dots of light. Under such circumstances, nobody could tell who was here to reinforce them and where they came from. However, everyone had a lot of faith and trust in Elder Song's words, and they also believed her because they were craving reinforcements to arrive too much in their hearts. The spectral army began to launch an offensive. Their point of entry was very coincidental. They charged in from a position between the western and northern fronts at the start of the battle. The soul beasts on these two fronts were led respectively by the Myriad Demon King and the Scarlet King, and they would definitely fight back if they were attacked. However, they were currently besieging the city with their full strength, and they didn't have much coordination between them. This external force actually forced their way deep into those soul beasts' ranks. The soul beasts at the back of the army were relatively weaker, most of them being 10-year and 100-year soul beasts. The spectral army charged through the army of soul beasts like a hot knife through butter. At this moment, there were 9 large pitch-black gates located about 20 kilometers northwest of Shrek City that nobody could see, and these gates were spurting out spectral creatures continuously. There were skeletons, liches, and frightening headless horsemen among these spectral creatures. Occasionally, there would be enormous creatures like abominations that possessed frightening fighting strength, but there were no creatures stronger than those entities. There was a tremendous scarlet gold vertical eye positioned in the sky in the center of and behind those 9 gates, the eye flickering with eerie and chilly light. This vertical eye's pupil was entirely white like snow, and deathly grey colors filled the space around it. There were streaks of scarlet gold colors with sun patterns around those grey hues. This vertical eye emanated intense spiritual undulations. Muffled incantations could be heard as those scarlet gold lights transformed into patterns that connected those 9 gates together so that they could be opened continuously. Eye of the Azura, a martial soul true body. Yes, Hua Yuhao was here. He had returned when Shrek City needed reinforcements most. He had arrived before evening, but he didn't rush towards Shrek City as soon as he reached it. He could clearly see what was happening to Shrek City high up in the sky from a distance. Hua Yuhao wasn't hasty and impulsive when he witnessed that terrifying beast tide, and he didn't head down to assist Shrek City despite his roiling emotions. He was very clear that even though he had become a soul sage, and he was far stronger than typical soul sages, he was still by himself after all. Could he deal with that tremendous army of soul beasts by himself? He couldn't, and he would have a very slim chance of charging inside Shrek City and meeting up with his companions, and doing so wouldn't help the situation. Killing several soul beasts from the outside wouldn't solve Shrek City's problems at all, so he had to think of other ways to resolve Shrek City's dire situation. Therefore, he began to prepare after studying the situation carefully, preparing for necromancy. Hua Yuhao was very clear that using necromancy and summoning spectral creatures to the Duoduo continent were the abilities of an evil soul master in everyone's eyes. However, he couldn't be bothered with his reputation at a time like this, and helping Shrek out of their siege was more important than anything else in the world. He began his necromantic spells. He relied on his formidable spiritual power, and unleashed one of the strongest necromantic spells that the Calamity Necromancer Electrolux had left on his spiritual imprints. Spectral Calamity. He couldn't unleash the full strength of Spectral Calamity, because he wasn't strong enough, so he could only summon those relatively weaker spectral creatures. Under such circumstances, they were the limit he could reach with his current strength. Those large black gates opened one after another and connected to the demiplane Electrolux had left behind for him. Hua Yuhao began to control and command those spectral creatures when they appeared, one after another. He didn't mobilize his spectral army as soon as they appeared. The spectral army needed time to accumulate, and when the day was still bright, he was afraid that his spectral army would cause chaos and panic in Shrek City when they appeared on the battlefield. Therefore, he waited until nightfall and the sky was completely dark, so nobody could clearly see the flatlands from a distance. Only then did Hua Yuhao command the spectral army that the Spectral Calamity had summoned towards Shrek City. Hua Yuhao had transformed into the Eye of the Azura, and he had released as much spiritual power as he could. He relied on the demiplane that Electrolux had left behind for him to summon a great many spectral creatures within a short period of time. Hua Yuhao understood that his spectral army would be no match for this beast tide, because he couldn't summon any top-tier spectral creatures. However, what he had to do now was buy time for Shrek, and he had to delay and hurt the soul beast army as much as possible. Only then could he create an opportunity for Shrek to survive. This method was a lot more meaningful and practical than just throwing himself onto the battlefield. Just as Hua Yuhao had predicted, his spectral army appeared at the most opportune time, because of his meticulous calculations. This army of reinforcements came very suddenly, but at the right time. Hua Yuhao managed to galvanize and reinvigorate Shrek City's morale. Furthermore, as luck would have it, he had mobilized his spectral army right when the Golden Tree was healing Shrek City's warriors. Shrek City's dire situation was instantly greatly ameliorated. Over on the eastern front, the city wall had been broken through, but Earth-type soul masters swiftly repaired it. The battle was still at its peak. Huo Yuhao chose to charge in from the northwest, because he had discovered that Bai Ji was too adept with healing on the southern front. Even though he didn't know she was the Emerald Swan, who was ranked number 4 amongst the 10 great savage beasts, he was unwilling to face an adversary like that. His spectral creatures weren't afraid of death, and his most important task was to deal as much damage to the Soul Beast army as possible. Huo Yuhao's spectral army would achieve a far smaller effect if he attacked on Bai Ji's front. Huo Yuhao's strange spectral army burst onto the battlefield. Most of them were skeletal soldiers and Jiangxia, who were low-tier undead. However, even though they were considered low-tier, they were still strong. 2 or 3 such undead stacked together had fighting strength comparable to a 10-year soul beast. Other undead, like those headless horsemen and abominations, were considered especially ferocious in battle. Furthermore, these undead were far less afraid of death than even soul beasts, and they didn't know what pain and fear were. All they cared about was attacking manically. Under such circumstances, the situation was gradually developing towards one that was beneficial for Shrek City. Huo Yuhao's spectral army was rapidly spent, but the undead creatures spawned continuously from behind. At this moment, the entire spectral army had charged onto the battlefield, and seemed endless as they charged madly towards the northwestern front. The Scarlet King and the Myriad Demon King had realized where the problem was at this point, but they still had to deal with the elders from the Sea God's Pavilion. Every single elder from the Sea God's Pavilion was a veteran of battle. Their age had given them much experience and made them resilient. Even though they could see what their reinforcements consisted of from the sky, at a time like this, it didn't matter why these unwelcome guests were here, because the enemy of their enemy was their friend. The army of soul beasts was the greatest threat to Shrek City. Therefore, they tried their best to preoccupy and restrain those powerful soul beasts, so that they couldn't direct the soul beast army, and so that they wouldn't participate in the battle against the undead creatures. The eye of the Azura quivered and finally descended from the sky, landing on the ground as it reverted to Huo Yuhao's original figure. The black gates closed up one after another. Huo Yuhao's spiritual power was almost completely spent. He had no choice but to stop the spectral calamity. Huo Yuhao still felt a little afraid as he stared at the immense army of undead. He knew that his body couldn't keep up with his current spiritual power. If he used this necromantic spell as a title Duoduo, he would probably be more frightening than any evil soul master, as he would possess an army of undead that was truly endless. If he could have powerful undead like liches and bone dragons, he could directly convert living beings into undead after death, and he would possess the strength to fight against powerful opponents. This thought disappeared as soon as it appeared in Huo Yuhao's mind. The pursuit of strength and greatness made him momentarily excited, but he broke out in a cold sweat in the next moment, because he remembered something that Electrolux had told him before. Electrolux had told him that he couldn't rely on this powerful ability to control undead. Otherwise, disaster and bloodshed would befall the continent if Huo Yuhao lost control of his undead army. That was very much something that he did not want to see. Huo Yuhao crossed his legs and sat down. He turned his sight inwards and withdrew his soul rings into his body. After his last rose gold and red soul ring entered his body, he became entirely transparent, before he disappeared into the air, just like that. Concrete material spiritual power allowed his million-year soul ring from the Skydream Iceworm to evolve once more. Imitation had become part of his innate abilities, and even though his spiritual power was almost entirely spent, imitation would still naturally protect him. Huo Yuhao could not be thinking about how much damage his undead army could do to the army of soul beasts. His top priority at the moment was to recover his spiritual power as quickly as possible, so that he could continue working hard to defend Shrek City. Bai Ji could see what was happening on the northwestern front, but she couldn't leave her own side behind, because they needed her protection. Intel passed from soul beast to soul beast and eventually to her, and she quickly found out the details about what was happening. The Emerald Swan's elegant face became ghastly pale. Where did this army of undead come from? Are they controlled by humans? If so, how frightening is that? She felt her heart ache as she watched soul beasts die one after another. Their losses had far exceeded their previous estimations. The beast god Qian knew that Shrek would be hard to deal with. Therefore, he had personally engaged in battle as soon as possible so that he could take out Shrek's most ferocious fighting strength as quickly as possible. Soul beasts weren't entirely shut off from the world. At the very least, they knew about Elder Mu's death. However, Shrek's hidden strength still exceeded their judgment. Elder Mu's spirit was still around, and he had teamed up with Elder Xian to seal Qian away. This had rendered the army of soul beasts leaderless, and they could only fight independently in terms of commandeering their fellow soul beasts. That wasn't all. Those stationary soul cannon shells fired from Shrek City brought unimaginable pain and damage to the army of soul beasts. Many soul beasts, even top-tier soul beasts, didn't know what was going on before they were turned into dust. Several thousand stationary soul cannon shells. These shells had caused more damage and injuries to the soul beasts than the frontline combat. More than 1 million soul beasts resided in the Great Star Doe Forest, but most of them were between 10 to 100 years old, while some couldn't even be considered soul beasts. This time, even though the Great Star Doe Forest's soul beasts had swarmed out, they had only mobilized about 400,000 soul beasts. Among them had been more than 300,000 soul beasts, who had between 10 to 100 years of cultivation. But now, how many soul beasts were left? There were less than 200,000 soul beasts remaining, which meant more than 40% of the soul beast army had perished on the battlefield. They were only assaulting a single human city. Shrek City wasn't considered a large-scale city, like the various empires' capital cities, but it had already caused so much damage to the Great Star Doe Forest's soul beasts. More than 100,000 of the soul beasts, who had perished, died from those stationary soul cannon shells. At this moment, the flatlands all around Shrek City were strewn with the carcasses of soul beasts. Some soul rings had been extinguished due to time, but new soul rings drifted out from other soul beasts who had just died. So what if they emerged victorious in this battle? Could they still charge into the human world like they had imagined at the start, so that they could weaken humans as much as possible? It was no longer possible. Bai Ji was clear that even if they won this battle, the soul beasts wouldn't gain much from this victory. After all, there wasn't much in the human world that soul beasts desired. The soul beasts were only fighting for their survival. But what were they going to do after this battle? Were they to continue fighting? Unless they didn't want the Great Star Doe Forest to survive, continuing to fight would only lead to their own death and destruction. Qian was powerful, but he couldn't fight against the entire world by himself. Shrek Academy had their ways to restrict him, but did the other empires in the Duoduo continent not have similar methods? Therefore, even if the soul beasts could annihilate Shrek City, the Great Star Doe Forest's soul beasts could only retreat back into the forest. This beast tide had become meaningless after their losses amounted to more than 40% of their total forces. They didn't weaken the humans. Instead, the humans dealt a heavy blow to the strength accumulated over 10,000 years by the Great Star Doe Forest. What do I do? What should I do? This video will end here.